Welcome to all PCU members. In this lesson, our topic is a good knight versus a bad bishop. Let's start with our first example, where we see this position. We see a white knight on c5 in a pretty controlling position of the black bishop on c8. However, there are other pieces still on the board in addition to the pawns. Moreover, the black pawn from e6 may advance to e5. That is, of course, if white allows it. Well, what should white do? That's the big question. And the answer is white should eliminate all other pieces from the board than those knight and bishop. And I'm talking, of course, only about the bishop on e2 and the knight on b5. So white correctly immediately traded the bishop for a knight. And again, this is one of those exceptions when it is a good deal to trade a bishop for a knight, because the remaining pieces, the knight and the bishop, is clearly to white's favor. Why? Because the white knight is active and the black bishop is pretty much stuck. And now the important move is to play e5, making sure for life to prevent black ever thinking of playing e5 and liberating that bishop and blocking our pawns on the color of their bishop. So far so good. White has a clear advantage, and we have to think what the next plan should be. Well, as typical for endgames, the next thing you need to look for is to activate your king. After we stabilized the static element of the position, now it comes about activation of our king. Now, from black's perspective, it'd be ideal if black could exchange the pair of pawns on f6. However, nobody is forcing white to accept that invitation. And of course, white should not trade on f6, because after a trade on f6, black would have the opportunity to advance the e-pawn and get the bishop out of the prison. Let's go back. And after f6, instead of the exchange on f6, white should play f4 to bring simply a backup. White wants to make sure that at all times he will have a pawn on e5 and restricting the black's bishop's mobility. Instead of f6, black played first king e7, also trying to activate his king, and that process continued for both sides. The king's getting into the game, white king already on d4. And this was the time when black played f6. Right now, white has a pleasant choice of winning a pawn immediately by exchanging on f6, again, transforming a positional advantage to material advantage. Trade, then play knight e4 and clear the route for the white king to attack the b5 pawn. However, black would gain some activity after playing b4 and then bishop a6, followed by some counterplay ideas of bishop f1. Although I have a feeling that with correct play, white should be able to win also in this position. Instead, in this position, white chose the principal move, playing b4, playing very positionally. The idea, of course, remains moving the knight out from c5, then playing king c5, and bringing the knight to attack the b5 pawn as well, if it will be protected by then. Of course, white also has the opportunity to play f4 at some point to back up on the e5 square. Black instead immediately captured on e5, allowing the white king to get there and now attack the pawn on e6, which black right away protected with king e7. And now let's see how white should improve his position. Again, we see the beautiful knight against the passive bishop, but how do we win the game? game f4, h5, g3. Now all the white pawns are away from light squares. Bishop d7, and time to reposition the knight. The exchange of the knight for the bishop would be a major mistake. Generally, as a rule of thumb, when we have a very active, well-positioned piece, we should not exchange it for another piece of a similar value, but in a more limited activity or in a more passive position. Like right now, the black bishop has no potential whatsoever. As all the white pieces are on dark squares, it doesn't matter how many moves it will make, it still will be a pretty useless bishop. Just to demonstrate that in reality also knight d7 would have been a mistake, I'll show you this variation. Knight takes, king takes, f5, pawn takes, king takes. Now it seems that white is pretty quick in winning one of the pawns. However, black can get timely counterplay. King d6, king g6, king d5, and doesn't matter which pawn white takes first, black will save the game. King g6, king b4, king g7. Of course, one would need to calculate all this variation all the way through before deciding on even allowing such a trade onto a pawn endgame or going for it. After king g7, the king simply moves out of the way of the pawn and the pawn runs, and black will arrive first, and that will allow black to then win white's only extra pawn on g3, so the two pawns finally got promoted. And a little check. Now the king needs to move to a square that will still protect the queen, and that will allow a fork, and then capturing the pawn on g3. Okay, so now we know not only in principle why it's a bad idea to trade the knight for the bishop, but we saw in practice that in reality it would spoil the game to a draw. Let's see the better choice, which white played, retreating the knight to b3, bishop c6, knight d4. Now the knight is in a very powerful, in its ideal position on d4, attacking the black bishop on c6, as well as the pawn on e6 at the same time, and pressuring also the b5 pawn. So it is the bishop's duty to guard all of that, and moved back to d7. And here comes the problem. White plays h3, black is running out of moves, and h4. And this is another beautiful example of Zugzwang, where black wishes he could say, I pass, I don't want to move again. You're not allowed to do that. Therefore, black is in trouble, because either he'll move the bishop, and whichever direction the bishop would move, black will lose either the b5 or the e6 pawn, or if black moves the king, as he did in the game, then the white king will let in to d6, attacking the bishop, and at the end of the day the bishop will have to move and give up on one of the pawns. And therefore black resigned. A very instructive endgame position that showed how a bishop that has no targets, that's in passivity, is so much inferior to a knight. This was a game played in London in 1985, but now let's see a game that was played 85 years earlier, in exactly 1900 in Paris, between two famous grandmasters of those days, Schlechter versus Janowski. The difference will be that there will be more pieces on the board, not just the knight and the bishop, but you'll certainly recognize those two heroes in the position. In this position, the problem is for black that even though there are other pieces, such as the rooks or the queens, the black rook on b8, because of the poor position of the bishop on c8, is also paralyzed. It's trapped there. It doesn't have an escape. It's really pitiful to see the black bishop and the black rook both being stuck in that small area without much realistic hope of getting out without loss of material. Right now, it's white to move, and before we look at how the game proceeded, I suggest you take a little bit of time for yourself and figure out what should be the game plan or your next move. The first thing to recognize is whether should we capture that pawn on d7 or not. And I think you can figure that out quickly, that would be a mistake, because all of a sudden it would give an opportunity for black to eliminate his worst positioned piece, the bishop on c8, by trading it for white's active knight, and then win the pawn back with queen f4. Moreover, win a second pawn on e5. So that certainly would be a big relief for black. But white had a much smarter idea, even though it involved sacrificing a pawn. Look how the game continued. White played e6. Okay, well, black doesn't have much of a choice. If he would move the queen, then pawn would take on d7, and that would be a lot of trouble. But what about pawn takes pawn? What's wrong with that? Well, first of all, the black pawn structure got even worse. Now black has 4 of his pawns being isolated. But at least one of them is an extra pawn. The other problem is that the d file has opened, and now it's a free path for a white queen or rook to do anything they want along that file, including getting the rook or the queen to d8. For now, quite importantly, white made a blockading move. White wants to make sure that black will not get the opportunity to play e5 at a moment and then activate his half-dead bishop. So the game continued with white playing queen e5 right now, making sure black won't play e5. And now the plan is to play rook d8 to pin the bishop. Therefore, black responded by playing queen e7, preventing just that. And now white needs to think again what should be the next game plan. Even though generally we say that we do not want to open up the pawns in front of our king, there are exceptions when we can afford to do that. Typically, when the opponent cannot create or develop an attack against our king timely to hurt us. So right now, white played g4, even though our king is there and there are still queens on the board. However, the other pieces of black's, the rook and the bishop, are highly unlikely to create any support to black's queen. Black responded by playing rook b4 without much threat, I would say. And now a very important move, king g3. On one hand, preventing any ideas of black of playing queen h4, and on the other hand, preparing of white playing h4 himself. There's not much black can do but to wait, rook b6, and now white was ready to advance further by playing h4. Black still doesn't have any active plan. Played queen f8, and white follows up by playing h5. White actually is using his own pawns on the h file, despite his king being right there on the g file, to open files to attack black's king. Game continued by pawn captures and queen captures. At this stage that the white pawn is already on g4, black playing e5 wouldn't help anything, because after white would capture with the queen, the black bishop would still be stuck on c8 without being able to get to f5. Black played rook b8, and white was ready to come back again to e5. And So did black, went back with the rook to b6. So now if queen c7, queen would take on c5, but white is ready to open the position further by playing g5. If pawn would take, the white queen would capture back, and then the white rook would be ready to come down to d8 to cause trouble on one hand, or in some cases the white rook could appear on the h file as well. Going back to the position after g5, black responded by trying to prevent the white queen from getting to g5 and played h5. And now white managed to find a creative way to immediately transform the huge strategical positional advantage to a win of material and the game. g6, check, king captured, queen g5 check, king h7, queen takes h5, king g8, and the queen went back to g5. And now we can see that the rook d8 is around the corner. King f7, rook d8, which is a fork, queen e7, and of course here white has many good moves, among them trading queens or capturing the bishop right away. He played queen h5 and black resigned. Black would be checkmated immediately after king f6 and knight e4, or playing g6 wouldn't drag the game that much longer either. White would check from h7 and then follow it up with knight e4, when the black king would be forced to leave the protection of the queen. What a well-played, beautiful middle game by Schlechter. And now let's move on to our jewels of the week, and in this lesson we'll have several of them. Okay, let's look at our first position. What do we see here? We see that white has an extra rook versus a bishop and pawn. That means white is up in exchange for a pawn. However, endgames typically, rook versus bishop, are a draw, even without black having an extra pawn as compensation. The fact that there is an extra pair of rooks on the board doesn't really change much in that evaluation. However, there is an amazing sequence using tactics that allows white to win the black bishop. Well, if you think about winning the black bishop, certainly the most natural move is to immediately attack it and pin it. So let's see how that spins out. Well, black can only use his king to defend the bishop. If the king would move to e6 or e7, then white could just check immediately, and then the king either will have to move away from the bishop, when it would be lost right away, or move it to f6, when an immediate second check on f2 skewer would follow and the bishop would be lost right away. So let's go back and see what if black decides to go the other way. The king moves to e8, and then after rook e2 the king moves to f8. This looks a whole lot better, although it's not really. Now white pins the bishop again. Black can protect the bishop. However, white successfully can use the already existing pin by playing rook g8 check. King has only one move, and beautifully we forced the black rook also onto the 7th rank, allowing white a pretty combination by capturing the bishop, followed by rook g7 and capturing black's rook on c7. What a beautiful sequence of moves. And let's see our second endgame. Here we go. In this position, white has an extra pawn, and fortunately it is the same color promotion square as our bishop, so that's certainly a good thing. Nevertheless, having so few pawns and pieces left on the board, With the black king being near the promotion square, white needs to play very accurately to actually win the game. Remember, if black would succeed to give up his bishop for white's passed pawn and trade also the pawns b5 and c3, the lone bishop is not sufficient to win the game. So therefore, white must do everything they can to try to promote the a pawn. And the correct answer is to advance the pawn, forcing black to come closer and try to catch the pawn. Of course, bishop c8 wouldn't do the job, as after a7, bishop b7, white would win that bishop immediately with a skewer. Okay, so back to the beginning. a6, king c6, and now bishop e8 check. And, is our pawn lost? Not really. Bishop takes, protects the pawn, but this is losing the bishop, isn't it? It is, but it allows our pawn to advance further. Bishop d5 catches it right away. But here comes the beautiful part of it. White plays c4 check. And even though black captures the pawn with a counter check, after the white king moves out to d4, black is helpless in catching white's passed pawn. What a beautiful endgame. And here is our final example of this lesson. Well, I have to admit that it's not highly likely to reach this position in a practical game, but it's nevertheless a beautiful idea. In this position, black has 5 extra pawns, which of course under normal circumstances would mean that white has a hopeless situation. Well, seemingly white can hope for only one thing, and that is that if he managed to get the queen to b7, that would be checkmate. However, that seems to be a pretty distant goal, considering the fact that the a1 square is covered by the black queen, and otherwise, for example, after queen d1, black will have time to try to cover the entry points. However, it's easier said than done. For example, playing queen d2 would lose right away, because then white would check and the queen would get to a6, or if black blocks the check, the queen would get to h8, then to c8, putting black in front of unsolvable troubles. Okay, let's go back. So is white winning after queen d1? Not quite. Both sides have to play accurately. Black actually has to go back with the queen to h8. And I have to say, this seems to solve the problems. That after queen a4 and queen a6, black can play queen c8. And it seems that black is just fine. No more checkmate, maintains the 5 extra pawns. White should resign, shouldn't they? Well, normally they should. But in reality, white is actually saving the game. Amazingly, white can just give up his queen and result a beautiful stalemate. Well, I hope you really enjoyed these fun endgames and learned from the first 2 examples, which were of course very practical and useful for your own games. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess examples. Bye-bye.